Good evening, everyone. My name is Maeve McAllister, and I am a senior politics and criminal justice double major and chair of the Kevin B. Harrington Ambassador Program at St. Anselm College. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. A's, I'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us this evening. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in civic and political life of their local, national, and global communities. A nonpartisan organization, the Institute has been dedicated to promoting an educated citizenry to ensure a healthy democracy for over 20 years. Tonight's program will feature a conversation between the Institute's Executive Director, Neil Levesque, and co-authors Major Garrett and David Becker to discuss their book, The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. Major Garrett serves as the CBS News Chief Correspondent and hosts a multi-platform interview show, The Takeout. Prior to this current position, Mr. Garrett has career covering multiple presidential administrations and national elections for CBS, CNN, Fox News, USA News, and World Report. An author of 4 other books, Mr. Garrett graduated in 1984 from the University of Missouri with degrees in journalism and political science. A native of San Diego, California, he now lives in Washington, D.C. David Becker is the Executive Director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research, working with election officials of both parties all around the country to ensure accessible, secure elections for all eligible voters. Prior to the CEIR, Mr. Becker worked as the Director of the Elections Program at the Pew Charitable Trust, spearheaded the creation Electronic Registration Information Center, and served 7 years as a senior trial attorney in the voting section of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. An alum of UC Berkeley, Mr. Becker serves as an election law expert for CBS and makes frequent appearances in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, PBS, NewsHour, and NPR. Lastly, Mr. Becker is also a 2-time Jeopardy champion and winner of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Please join me in welcoming David Becker and welcoming back Major Garrett to the Institute.
David, it's twice Jeopardy and once Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
Thanks for reminding me that I probably should clean up my my bio a little bit.
Well, the IRS
No, the
must like
audience
it.
loves that.
It was a
That's
while ago.
amazing. It's amazing.
I don't think we've ever had a Jeopardy winner up here on the stage, so it's pretty
Well,
good.
not one that was dumb enough to put it in their bio.
Well, thanks for making your way, both of you, for coming, for writing a wonderful book.
It's great for me to be
Very
back.
comprehensive. Yes.
Yes, always great to be
We
here.
have
Thank you so
14
much for having
months to
us.
go.
Yes.
This is a great book.
Thank you.
And very comprehensive. It's a lot about truth. But why don't we just start and give the audience and people who are watching on the stream an overview of the book and why it is you wrote it.
David and I often say that we had to write this book, we just wish we didn't have to. That is to say, we had to write a book about what actually happened in 2020. That it was an American success story, not the outcome of the election, but the election itself. And the reason we call it an American success story is because the 2020 election was hard to put together for a couple of reasons. The biggest reason, of course, was the pandemic. The primaries that occurred right at the beginning of the pandemic were very difficult to carry out, and the ones that came after that also difficult, and lots of things were learned from that process. But there was a very short period of time between those primaries and the general election to adapt to the pandemic, to train a new generation of poll workers, about 400,000 in our country. Why do we have to train that many? Well, because about that number of historically active poll workers opted out. Why did they opt out? Because they were ages 60, 70, and 80. The most vulnerable population in our country to COVID. Most vulnerable population anywhere to COVID. And all those new poll workers, my eldest daughter was one of them, by the way, were trained almost entirely via Zoom. A hard thing to do in election administration. But we did it. Plus, there was lots of litigation before the 2020 election, about 400 or so lawsuits, more litigation before that election than any election in our history. That litigation delayed the final creation of the ultimate rules that election administrators had to use to put in force to make sure they were complying with the law. They did so, but that delay made all their work harder. A lot of adaptations were carried out. In some cases, mail voting for the first time. So there had to be preparations to handle those ballots, process them, count them, tabulate them, verify them, etc. All of that work was done under enormous deadline pressure. The people who were doing this work had to do it in person, so they had to risk their own health because, again, we had no vaccines, we had social distancing, but this work was not a socially distant exercise at all. All of these very hard things had to be done, and they were done. And 20 million more Americans participated in 2020 than in 2016. It was the highest turnout election in our history, the most diverse electorate in our history, under the hardest circumstances ever confronting anyone putting on an election in this country since the Civil War. Growing up in this country, the America that I knew considered what happened and would have considered what happened in 2020 to be a distinctly American success story. A kind of thing where Americans did what we like to tell ourselves we always want to do: collaborate, cooperate, innovate, adapt to hard circumstances with very little roadmap, and do so under an inflexible deadline and make it work, and not accept failure at any level as an option. All of those things happened. We did a really wonderful thing for ourselves. We carried out this election. We followed the rules, and millions more of us participated than ever before. We wanted to write a book about that. To say this thing that's been slandered in some parts of our country doesn't deserve, A, to be slandered, and B, deserves to be celebrated. And I'll have the rest of the story.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, the slander started well before the election, even. And Major and I had started discussing this. But the reality, and Major alluded to this, is that the 2020 election, up until, what was it now, 23 days ago, was the most secure, transparent, and verified election in American history. Don't take our word for it. Take the word of President Trump's own Department of Justice, President Trump's own Department of Homeland Security, President Trump's own campaign, President Trump's own family. And we know this objectively through a variety of ways. These aren't things that are just made up and said off the cuff. One of the ways you make elections secure in the United States is that regardless of whether you use technology to count the ballots or, and New Hampshire is one of the only states that does this still, counts some of them by hand, you have paper ballots that you can go back to and audit and recount. And by the way, by hand or by machine is equally secure. In fact, honestly, when you have really long ballots, as some do in some of the states, dozens of pages with dozens of races on them, machines are actually faster and more accurate in the first unofficial count. Now, you still need the audits. What do we know about 2020? 2020 had the largest percentage and largest number of auditable, recountable, verifiable paper ballots in American history. 95% of all Americans voted on paper in 2020. That number is going to get darn close to 100% in 2024. The percentage in 2016 was only about 75 to 80%. Every single battleground state in 2020 had entirely paper ballots. We had never seen that before. In 2016, the entire state of Georgia had no paper ballots. Most of North Carolina and Pennsylvania didn't have paper ballots. All of those states were entirely paper ballots by 2020. And for the first time in American history, pretty much every paper ballot state audited those results. 43 states in DC audited those results to confirm that the technology worked properly. That's what you're trying to do with those audits. We had more pre-election litigation, and Major alluded to this, than we have ever seen in American history. And that pre-election litigation, there's nothing wrong with bringing pre-election litigation. It's important. It clarifies the rules of the game before you play it. It is really important to know that by the time the polls closed in every single place around the country on election night 2020, everyone, campaigns, parties, candidates, everyone, knew those rules that they were playing under. You can't complain about rules of the game that you knew were in effect beforehand and you didn't challenge, or you challenged and lost. I might draft the best field goal kicker in the NFL, but if I lose the Super Bowl by a point, I can't complain that field goals should have been worth 5 points. That's not the way it works. And then, after the election, we saw more post-election litigation that confirmed the results than ever before. We sit here now, well over 750 days since the 2020 election, and there is not one single piece of evidence that has been presented to any court anywhere in the country or to any law enforcement agency, despite law enforcement agencies asking for it, that casts any doubt on the outcome of the presidential election or any other part of the election in 2020 in any state. 750 days. And what did we achieve, as Major indicated? We had the highest turnout in American history, both by raw numbers of ballots, 20 million more ballots than had ever been cast in any election in American history in 2020, and the highest turnout in any presidential election by percentage, 2/3 of all eligible voters, since universal suffrage since the 19th Amendment. Really remarkable by itself, but it was done in the middle of a global pandemic, when election officials, and Major alluded to this, were putting themselves at risk. They had to find new polling places, they had to find new poll workers, they had to train them. Some of them were doing things that had been planned in advance, like implementing these new paper ballot systems that they knew were going to happen, but they just didn't know they'd have to do it in the middle of the most scrutinized election in American history in the middle of a global pandemic. And the reward of these tens of thousands of election officials that we rely upon, and the hundreds of thousands of volunteers who help us facilitate our democracy, instead of getting, honestly, the parade that they probably should have gotten, they found themselves constantly, and as we sit here today, still under abuse, harassment, and threats. And that troubled us a great deal. It's why we felt this obligation to write this book. I mean, I mentioned the 22 election. I know we're going to get to that in a second, Neil, but I mean, recognize the 22 election was even better, and that's always the case. We are constantly improving as we learn more about how to do these things. And the fact is the 2024 election will be even more secure and verified and accessible than any election we've ever had.
So it's particularly special in New Hampshire because I think we know in our small towns who these people are that volunteer for these jobs. When you go to the polls, it's like going to the dump. You see your relative and your friend down the road, and it's a very, very communal thing. And to think that these people were sort of taking enormous risk, and the fact that you were focusing in on them originally in the book is amazing. I think it's a real testament. People there, they really are unheralded as far as the work that they do in particular states like New Hampshire. I want to get a little bit to the, in the book, again, it's very comprehensive. You focus on 3 Januaries. We can get into that. But again, you're making this case throughout this entire book for something that is plain and simple. It's almost the sky is blue. And yet, there's a huge segment of Americans who say, no, they're looking at the same sky as we are. They're looking at the same, they have access to the same facts, and yet they say the election was stolen. And you mentioned the 1960s when we had a lot of disagreements, but a lot of it was on big issues like Vietnam. This seems to be about a person, not about any issue. And so that's the fascinating thing. So what is it about Trump that really separates him and makes him this person that no matter what he says, no matter how far-fetched or what color the sky he says it is, that people follow him?
So I first came to New Hampshire in 1992. That's the first presidential campaign I covered. I've been coming to New Hampshire ever since, for every presidential cycle. I obviously spent a lot of time at Trump rallies in New Hampshire. I've met New Hampshire voters who are deeply supportive of the former president, and I respect them. I was here when he won the New Hampshire primary. Essentially, with that and the South Carolina primary ending the entire conversation about the Republican nomination. As we write in the book, and we take very careful aim to try to talk to those who are deeply disappointed Trump supporters. And I've met them. I've attended more than 100 Trump rallies in my coverage of the former president. both when he was a candidate, nominee, and president. I think I have a feel for them. I'm not an expert, but I think I have a feel for them. And part of the denialism component of this, I think, factors in 2 or 3 ways. One, there's a continuum. There are people who say, I have questions, I have suspicions, I have doubts. That's sort of at this end of the continuum. And then there are people, no, it was stolen, and I'll never believe anything else. And not only that, it was stolen, and we ought to do something about it. And that's on the far end of the January 6th continuum. And not everyone is, it's a cross-section. And we don't say in the book that anyone who's a Trump supporter is over here on January 6th. We don't. Say a lot of them may just be disappointed and wonder what happened. And we explain, one of the reasons I wrote the book was to talk to them. Say, this is what happened. And I'm going to use a word that Abraham Lincoln used to use. I urge people who are supporters of former President Trump, who believe his agenda was good for the country, who believe his presidency was successful, to believe all those things, but to disenthrall yourself from the big lie. A, it's not productive for the Republican Party, the party you like. It's not productive for the former president, and it's not true. But even if you don't care about the third thing, that it's not true, it's bad politics and it's bad strategy. Because back to your point, the strategic core of the big lie is that you have to believe your friends and neighbors are conspirators against you.
That's exactly right.
You have to believe they're conspirators, they're criminals operating against you in your own neighborhood to fix an election, which they don't do and haven't done. So another part of this conversation within the Trump world is denialism over time became a proxy for how much you're still with the former president. We saw this in primaries all over the country. How much you supported the former president and his agenda was filtered through not the agenda, not China tariffs or border policies or crime or defense spending or Space Force or tax cuts or regulations, but it was filtered through this other question. Was the 2020 election stolen? And that became kind of a good housekeeping
And we saw that here in New Hampshire with the U.S. Senate race.
You sure did. Which is kind of a embodiment of what I said a minute ago. Bad strategy, bad politics. So that is now being reassessed after the midterm elections. This idea that this good housekeeping seal process and filtering all this through how much you support former President Trump and are you really an authentic Trump supporter? Because if you don't deny the 2020 election, you can't really be authentic. I think that's all being reassessed. But I think that was a big component part of it for the last 2 years.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, if for those of you who really haven't thought about it, but I think you probably know this in New Hampshire more than almost any other state, because New Hampshire is so decentralized and so related to local politics. And so when you go to vote, people know each other in the polling places. You know the workers, you know your local clerk in most cases. That might not be true in other parts of the country. But for a national election to be stolen, especially given the safeguards that we've built up over time, paper, statewide voter registration databases that check whether someone's voted once or twice, you can't vote twice, by the way, confirmed mail ballots, audits of the ballots, recount provisions, court reviews. For a national election to be stolen in this country, it would require a level of prognostication that we don't have computers for. And secondly, it would require a conspiracy of about 1 million people in the United States of America, half of whom are with the losing party, all working in concert and none of them talking. What's the chance of that? And we talk about this in the book. There's a chapter we call Misdirection, because there is this element of whack-a-mole. Because actually, when you think about what would need to go into this, it's ludicrous. It does not hold even the tiniest bit of water. But they distract, and we call it misdirection for a purpose, by throwing out all of these things. We've all heard about the suitcase of ballots in Fulton County, right? We might, for those of you who really got into this, you might have heard about Antrim County, Michigan, and the Dominion software. You might have heard about the truck full of mail ballots driving through the night from the coast to Erie, Pennsylvania. You might have heard about the bamboo ballots that were shipped on a plane overnight into Arizona. Of course, we've all heard about the satellites and the Italian satellite and the German server, right? The dead Venezuelan dictator. You got to keep throwing stuff. And they want the people defending the election to fall back into a defensive mode and play an endless game of whack-a-mole. Because once you whack that suitcase full of ballots in Fulton County down, which it's been done many times, they'll go around to some of the other things, and then that thing pops right back up again, doesn't it? And if you follow this, that's what they want the people defending the election to do. What this book tries to do, although we deal with that, we also tell the actual story, the positive story of the election. Because back to your question, the incentive structure is very out of whack right now. You have people who are lining their pockets off of the big lie, in addition to thinking that they might obtain temporary political power. And their targets, their prey, are not people who are happy with the outcome of the 2020 election. They're not going to contribute to that. It's the people, the tens of millions of Americans, good Americans, who preferred Donald Trump to Joe Biden and were sincerely disappointed in the outcome of the presidential election. And the predators are targeting that prey for an endless series of donations. And they have to keep them angry, and they have to keep them divided, they have to keep them siloed in their media silos so they don't hear the truth. Because if they start hearing the truth, as hard as it might be for them to comprehend that they've been the victim of a very long, very lucrative con, they might stop donating. And some people's livelihoods are entirely dependent upon that now, because they have so demolished their own credibility that that's all they have left. And honestly, this book was written to, I mean, we used to talk about surviving Thanksgiving. I guess now it's the holidays that we're talking about surviving. But when good Americans who are sincerely disappointed in the outcome of the election bring up these things that they've seen on, let's be honest, propaganda websites, and they keep hearing it over and over and over and over again. One of the other great ones I've heard is, well, there's no way Joe Biden could have gotten 81 million votes. And the polls all showed that Trump was winning, which isn't even true, but let's just say for the argument that it was. So this election outcome couldn't have been right. The sad thing about that is that's the best argument for arguing that Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election that I've ever heard in my life. And she did not win the 2016 election, I'm sorry. She lost the 2016 election. That election was verified by rules that we all understood. You don't have to like the rules. I'm just saying those were the rules. And Donald Trump won a majority of votes in states that comprised a majority of the Electoral College, and that's a fact.
So let's dig into
Which
a
we
little
talk
bit
about in the book as well.
to the business of politics you just mentioned. You actually say that business of politics is too nice a word, but your book is so comprehensive that you go through each person who's written a book saying the election was stolen, and they actually come out with different reasons and outcomes. Describe that.
I read all the books, so you don't have to, as the phrase.
And thankfully, so I didn't have to read all of them either, but which I appreciate.
And they all have a different way of explaining how the election was stolen. And that's a sort of core problem. And it fell back to me to remember my earliest days as a young reporter, not covering politics, but covering crime. I was a police reporter in Amarillo, Texas. I was a police reporter in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I, for a brief time, was a police reporter in Houston, Texas, all before I got to Washington.
There's a lot of training there.
Yeah, exactly. And because it's a great beat. It really is. And it's a great way to learn the fundamentals of journalism. And one thing you learn as a crime reporter is if there's a crime, the cops don't come up with 17 explanations as to how the crime occurred. And prosecutors don't tell a jury 17 ways in which the defendant is guilty. No, there's one body of evidence, there's one motive, and there's one perpetrator, or two perpetrators, or however many the evidence leads to. Prosecutors and cops don't say there are 17 or 18 or 19 different ways in which the same crime was committed. And that's where we find ourselves. I don't know if we're on the 19th, 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd variation of explaining how the election was stolen, but we're at that number or higher, and that doesn't make any logical or credible or evidentiary sense. It doesn't, at any level. And that's not only a matter of logic, it's a matter of why do we have so many explanations? Well, because the first, second, third, fourth all fell apart. Why did they fall apart? Because they had no evidentiary basis. It couldn't be proved. They couldn't be substantiated in any place. And that's the kind of essence of a grift.
Yeah.
That's actually kind of a classical definition of a grift. That you keep changing the story to keep the audience, I'm going to go back to that word, enthralled with the story, and to keep them engaged and, as David mentioned, donating.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, if you follow some of the grifters on social media, which is the only place they want to make their case, they don't want to actually have to present evidence in a court, will be subject to cross-examination and scrutiny. You constantly hear something similar. We actually talk about this in the book. You know, there's a pillow salesman out there who says that there's a blockbuster lawsuit that we're bringing. It'll reinstall Trump. It's going to overthrow the Arizona election. It's going to do it, and it's coming. It's coming. Just like, you know, the grifter pastor who's telling you the world is going to end on such and such date, and the day after that date, he says, "Oh, I must have misinterpreted the message. It's actually this other date that's in the future. Keep donating." It's the same stuff. These grifters are all competitors. That's one of the reasons we're hearing this. They're competing for that same pool of sincerely disappointed supporters of the former president to capture as much money as they can before the grift ends. And it's truly unfortunate. I mean, because again, if you take a step back, if you are someone who's sincerely disappointed in the outcome of the election, and let's be honest, who in America hasn't been incredibly disappointed in the outcome of an election in the last 10 years? Is there anyone? I mean, we have a great deal of sympathy for that. Yeah. I mean, everyone in this room has experienced that. But it falls apart under even the tiniest of scrutiny, which is why over 60 courts, 8 Trump-appointed judges, his own campaign officials, his own attorney general, his own Department of Homeland Security, his own Department of Defense, thought this was ridiculous.
And dangerous.
And think about this. All 150 or so members of the House of Representatives that objected to the electoral vote count late at night on January 6th were all elected on those very same pieces of paper that they were objecting to. They were literally casting doubt on their own authority granted by those ballots. Members of the Arizona State Senate that commissioned that cyber ninja's ridiculousness. Most of them were elected on those same paper ballots in 2020. This is what we're seeing, that there's this disconnect from reality that is being fed by greed and lust for power.
So on November 8th, obviously, if you look at any of these races across the country, which were close, or at least in competitive races, anyone who was an election denier lost.
In the most conspicuous and high visibility races.
In the battleground states.
Yes.
I mean, that's not true.
So
in
some other
of the states
deniers
right now.
won, for sure.
But I mean, even in states like
But where the spotlight
Maine's-
was shown, harsh and bright, they lost.
And when I was reading the book, I was thinking, well, this was written before that, and obviously there's a lot of background and a lot of deep look at the 2020 election and all the absurdity that's out there, what you just described in particular, that business of churning money. But it was rejected to some degree by at least a small segment of voters. So to some degree, the cream is rising to the top. Would you agree?
I think that is a fair assessment. And earlier this week in Miami, I had the pleasure of sitting down with 2 secretaries of state, one Democrat, one Republican. Jocelyn Benson from Michigan, she's a Democrat. Brad Raffensperger from Georgia, he's a Republican. Both of whom won re-election as secretaries of state. In Jocelyn Benson's case, she defeated a Republican nominee who was a full-throated election denier, Christine Caramo. In Brad Raffensperger's case, he defeated a Republican election denier, Jody Heiss, in the Republican primary. Both of them have real lived experience taking on denialism and making their case statewide. And I asked them both, is denialism dead? And they said no. But it has been given a brushback. In baseball terminology, a brushback pitch, if you will. It's been pushed back. It's back on its heels a little bit. But they are not at the least bit confident that this conversation is over, or this sort of festering doubt and skepticism can't reassert itself. And both of them said that they learned something in this process that they're going to take forward in their next term as Secretary of State, which is to be much more aggressive about talking about procedures, process, and transparency, how they do their work. Most Secretaries of State, now Bill Gardner's a wonderful slight difference in that. Bill Gardner doesn't need a communications team. I know he's no longer Secretary of State. I know he's not, but he was for a very, very long time.
For a very long time.
Very long time. He was his own communications director. You know, he didn't need a press staff. Most Secretaries of State around the country have never even thought about that. The idea of having a team around you to communicate. Most Secretaries of State not only work on elections, they do lots of other things, but this is not regarded as a kind of comms-centric job. It isn't. But they now understand that they need to communicate, need to talk, and take on this other dimension of the job, which is explanatory. And both of these Secretaries of State, Republican and Democrat, have said to me on my show, The Takeout, which Maeve was kind enough to mention, I'm going to do a lot more of that. I understand now that I have to go out and talk to people and take their doubts, skepticism, and legitimate questions and walk them through it. Because when I do that, they understand more, and I have told our procedural story better. And I think we're going to see more of that, and that will be, if that happens in more and more states, more of a remedy to this underlying, festering nastiness of denialism.
I mean, I think one thing to recognize about Secretaries of State or chief election officials, they're occasionally lieutenant governors, they're occasionally state boards of elections. And unlike New Hampshire, most of them are directly elected by the people. And up until about 2 or 3 years ago, people had no idea what the Secretary of State did in their state. Now they have more of an idea, sometimes it's a wrong idea, but they had no idea of what the Secretary of State did. When I was back at Pew, I did some polls on this, and I asked in several states people to say, who's the chief election official in your state? And for instance, in California, I gave them choices. California Secretary of State, the California State Board of Elections, the Attorney General, the Lieutenant Governor, other. 7% of respondents got that right. It is the California Secretary of State.
7.
Yeah, 7. 17% said the California State Board of Elections, which is truly remarkable because there is no California State Board of Elections. This is common. I mean, understand, and if you talk to your town clerks, you'll probably hear this. The best case scenario for an election official at any level, whether it's the Secretary of State or a local election official, their best case scenario, their reward for a job well done, a perfectly run election, which never happens, but a very well run election, is anonymity. It's that the Wednesday after the election, nobody is talking about how the election was run. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario up until a couple years ago was Florida 2000, that you were Catherine Harris or Teresa Lepore, if you happen to remember those names. The fact that we know who those people were shows how unusual that circumstance is. But now, election officials all over the country, from secretaries of state like Jocelyn and Brad, from county election officials and local clerks who are paid to do this as a job, to volunteer poll workers, are finding themselves doxxed and threatened and their lives being made a living hell. And so there's a whole new definition of what this job is, largely, for election officials, and many are leaving because of this. And so the fact is, it's true. I mean, if you had asked us a month ago, and the beginning of the book lays out some possible scenarios that fortunately we were not predicting, but we were warning about as a possibility, and they did not come to pass. And that's very good news. We are better off today than we were a month ago. We have a little better sense about our democracy, and the guardrails are in place. And it's not just because if you're a Democrat because Democrats won or because certain Republicans won. It's because the people who won whether they're conservative Republicans like Brad Raffensperger or Democrats like Jocelyn Benson, believe in the guardrails of democracy, believe in the people having a voice. I'm also a little bit concerned that we're not out of the woods. We have a declared presidential candidate who is the election denier-in-chief. We have swarms of other people who are adopting these lies. And I don't know yet that we can say that the reason that election deniers lost in the states that they ran was because people put democracy first. It might have been a lot of other things. Voters are very complex. I've been doing research for a long time. It could have been abortion, it could have been the economy, it could have been that some of them just seemed weird. We don't know. And we'll find that out more. But we are better off today than we were a month ago because guardrails seem to have been strengthened. We're still waiting on things like the Electoral Count Act reform, which we hope will pass Congress in a lame duck. I think that's very important. There's some other things we talk about in the book that need to happen, but these next 2 and perhaps more years are going to be somewhat perilous because the damage that has been done to our democracy over time is foundational. It's not going to be one election where the candidate you like wins that's going to fix that. We're going to need to be vigilant and do the hard work of repairing our democracy over a course of several years, unfortunately. And that's true even if the election denier-in-chief magically goes away somehow, because that damage goes to the very core of our democracy.
So before we get to questions, I want to throw one last thing in that. We've spent a lot of time talking about Trump and obviously 2020, but in your book, you actually go back to 2004, and you talk about some of the things that the Democrats actually did, which really sowed some of the seeds. So describe some of that. So,
First of all, we talk in the book about close elections at the presidential level throughout our history. 1800, first transition from one party to the next. That election was thrown into the House of Representatives, and if you go back and read the books, I read a couple. The entire question of the future of the American experiment was sort of hanging in the balance in 1800. Would this actually happen? Would there be a peaceful transition of power from one party to the next? 1824, the corrupt bargain that denied Andrew Jackson presidency. He came back and won in 1828. 1876, an election that we truly don't know the result of, but through a lengthy process, it was determined ultimately a presidential winner. And there was a huge compromise that underlay that, the end of Reconstruction. We had a very close election in 1960, in the middle of the Cold War, when the central question for our country was who best to lead and protect a country in a nuclear age, a rather significant set of stakes, you might argue, and a very, very close election in one state, Illinois. We go through all of that. And then we also talk about 2000. I interviewed one of the lawyers involved, Barry Richard, and what that atmosphere was like in the legal back and forth over a very close election, 537 votes in Florida, in 2 counties where, because of ballot design flaws, there were legitimate questions that the judiciary accepted as legitimate inquiries into voter intent. These were judiciable questions. And we didn't really have a set of laws or procedures to iron them out quickly. And it was a very fraught, I don't need to remind anyone in this room, couple of weeks on to a month over how to resolve this. Then 2004, there's a question about Ohio. And some Democrats, a very small number, said that there was something possible either about long lines in Columbus or voting machines that were so problematic they wanted to object. 2004, once that happened there. Then in 2016, there were those who raised questions about that. Then there was Stacey Abrams in 2018 who raised questions about the governor's election in Georgia. These are not morally equivalent. In none of those cases did anyone storm the Capitol or commit acts of violence or talk on social media about committing acts of violence. The nominees involved did not endorse these efforts. They are not morally equivalent. It's not 100 to 0, but as David likes to say, it's not 50-50. It's not 50-50, it's not 100 to 0. But Republicans have used that history at times to say we are not denialists if they're not denialists. Why don't you call them denialists? Well, we do. They're just not the same. And there is not a moral equivalency or a structural equivalency there. But we do say that you need to look at the actual evidence of elections, and even if you're disappointed, accept them. That's what democracy requires. It requires hard things. Democracy requires really hard things. Campaign really hard, you believe truly, you think your interests are jeopardized, you believe your country may be led in a terrible direction, and you've got to take it. One of the things that was difficult in Vietnam, that era. There was a segment of our country that thought literally the government of our nation had lost its mind and continued to prosecute endlessly this unwinnable war. It led to tremendous strife in this country. I read a great deal about it to understand if we are as divided now as we were then. So yes, we talk about that. And we don't describe those Democrats who raise those objections as similar in kind to denialists now, but we don't ignore that history either.
And one thing to note here is that all the elections that Major just talked about, they were truly close elections. 2004 wasn't that close, but even then, 2004 was one state, about 120,000 vote margin in that state. But 2000, one state, 537 votes. 1960, one state. I can't remember the exact margins, a few thousand votes. The 2020 election was the largest margin, had the largest margin in the presidential race in the 21st century, where Barack Obama wasn't on the ballot. Put that into context. A minimum of 3 states, all of which were decided by 5 figures. I want to put this into context as well. And I think New Hampshire, people who live in New Hampshire will get this in a way that many others wouldn't. How big is a 10,000 vote margin in the state of New Hampshire? It's a pretty big margin here, right? In every state, whether it's New Hampshire or whether it's California, what we election lawyers call a 10,000 vote margin is a landslide. No statewide election in American history with more than a 1,000 vote margin, and it's actually probably a little bit less than that, has ever been overturned by recount or court order, ever. Once you get to the 10,000 vote level, it's not changing. I have news for you. Now look, we have an election currently that's going to likely be recounted once the results in Arizona are certified. The Arizona Attorney General's race is in the 500 vote margin. The chances that gets overturned in any way is as close to 0 as you can get, but it is still within their margin of state law that they're going to recount, and that process is going to proceed, and it's good. It's all paper ballots. We're going to know exactly how those ballots were counted. We're not relying upon the machines. We're going to have the paper that we can go back to the voters marked. But we had a pretty wide margin in 2020. It wasn't that close. And the difference between that and the much, much tamer questions that were raised in these other elections, and by the way, we also point out how dutiful Vice President Nixon and Vice President Gore both were as the losing presidential candidates and presiding over their joint session of Congress. The difference is the losing candidate did not make it his job from that point forward to continue to fundraise and fan the flames. We have not seen that ever in American history. And this is the same presidential candidate, it's a point I think is really important, who didn't even avail himself of his legal rights if he thought he had a valid claim. Under state laws of the state of Michigan, the state of Wisconsin, and the state of Pennsylvania, a losing candidate, any losing candidate, you don't even finish in second place, can request a full statewide recount of their race. The only thing is they have to pay for it. You remember—
And accept the results.
Well, they don't have to, but it's kind of implied that if you're going to avail yourselves of your remedies, you're going to accept those remedies. And I don't know if you recall, but in 2016, candidate Jill Stein actually did that. She fundraised for a recount in those states. Those recounts confirmed the outcome, and she availed herself of that process. Does anyone know how many of those 3 states candidate Trump requested a full statewide recount in? 0. Would have cost about $19 million, it was estimated. He had raised at that point where he would have had to request a recount just in the post-election period well over 10 times that amount. And he did not avail himself of that remedy. This, I think, speaks volumes about the nature of the grift and its depth of corruption, and how it's different than anything else we've ever seen, we talk about in the book.
All right, let's get to some questions. I think we have a mic right here. So speak into the mic so the people who are online can hear you. Questions?
Hi, Brett Jesse from Bedford. Things move kind of slow here, so I'm not sure I'm catching up with all the world affairs regarding election casting, counting, and collection of ballots. But I think I've heard something new, at least to me, that yes, the election was stolen fair and square. Is that just another whack-a-mole, or is that a pivot to a new strategy, do you think?
I mean, I think it could be both. I mean, it is definitely not true. Look, there's...
And I think when I've heard that said, the next sentence is, well, they changed the rules. They shouldn't have changed the rules, and by the rules that they changed, they made it harder for Trump to win, so they followed the rules, and that's how they cheated fair and square. Is that your understanding of that assessment, sir?
It could be that. There's a little bit of FBI thrown in there.
I think there's more about that. I mean, there's look, I want to be as crystal clear as I can be about this. We are well over 2 years since the 2020 election. I'm an election lawyer. I used to work for the Department of Justice. I work in evidence. I work in creating cases. That's plenty of time. By the way, elections are also transparent. A lot of these documents are public records. Voter lists you can buy anytime. These are open to the public. This can all be reviewed, and still not a shred of evidence has come forward, and I'm going to define it very clearly here, that any number of ineligible voters voted in any way that would have changed the outcome of the race in any state in 2020 or in any other election, really, in recent history. The total number of voter fraud cases that have been prosecuted and where there's been a conviction in those 2 years, I believe is fewer than the number of fingers on my hands nationwide. You know, there's allegations, and by the way, these aren't all even cases that someone has been ineligible and voted. Some of the cases that got the most notoriety were about 20 people were accused of having registered to vote when they were ineligible felons in Florida, for instance. You might have heard that. That was brought about in August. None of those cases have gone to trial. None of those people have been convicted. And in fact, 2 of those cases have been dismissed, because these people were actually told under confusing Florida laws that they had restored their eligibility, and they were confused by that. I mean, we have no evidence of this in any way. And what they're trying to do is just to find ways of recasting their failed arguments in new ways that will appeal to people who might hit click here to donate.
And we also want to point out that we take note of what many Trump supporters regard as a disproportionate level of media interest in the Mueller investigation and the dossier as compared to Hunter Biden's laptop. We talk about that. We address that square on and say, this is one of the reasons Trump supporters have grievances and are reluctant to listen to someone like me tell them that the election was safe, secure, and verifiable. Well, where was all they would argue, and I've heard them, and I've gotten the text messages and the emails, where was all this interest in Hunter Biden's laptop? And the argument goes, if there had been more, Trump would have won. Now, no one knows that to be true or untrue, but that's part of the grievance matrix. We don't ignore that, and we don't not give voice to that. We recognize that that is part of a sort of catalog of things that Trump supporters look at and say, this doesn't feel proportionate to us. And we address that in the book. Not to validate it or invalidate it, but to say this is a backdrop for why some people are still suspicious about this election. And again, I'll go back to that word disenthrall. All those things that you have a grievance about or support the Trump agenda for, hold on to. But in this one area, because, as David referred to, but it's an important fact, even in the following the rules, and the rules were corrupted and they worked against Trump, that doesn't hold water either, because Republicans won more of the pre-litigation cases than they lost by a sizable margin.
7 out of 8.
So they knew the rules, and they won most of the cases where they tested these new rules, and they still lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly right. I mean, I don't know of a losing presidential candidate yet in American history who feels like the media played fair with them. And whether it's the Trump supporters or the grifters who are leveraging the narrative that says Trump was treated unfairly, or whether it's Hillary Clinton supporters who, putting aside the validity of this, and there's valid opinions on multiple sides here, believe that the media and the FBI's release of the letter in the days before the 2016 election had an effect on the election. That you can allow yourself to think whether you think the candidate you supported was dealt fairly by the media. What we're talking about in the book is that voters who went to vote on election day and cast their ballots, those ballots were correctly tabulated. The right outcome was reached. If someone convinced someone to vote for the wrong candidate for the wrong reason, you can believe that all you want. But we're telling you that when they marked their ballot, even if you don't agree with why they marked their ballot that way, that ballot was correctly tabulated, and the correct outcomes were reached. And this is one of the things that bothers us a lot. I mean, it is absolutely a well-established rule in American politics that you can think that your opponent is completely wrong and that people who are voting for them are fools. I mean, that's, excuse me, we're going to see that in every election. But to attack the process, and as importantly, the people who run that process, who are our neighbors, who are our friends and family members, that goes beyond anything we've ever seen. Excuse me.
Next question.
Yep.
Wait for the mic. Sorry.
Thank you. David, your last, not this last comment, one before it, you ended up with click here to donate. And I'm just wondering, how bad is the influence of money in the elections? I mean, the amount of money spent in our elections here in New Hampshire was phenomenal. MUR must be handing out bonuses like crazy. But I wonder, do you have any feeling toward supporting national supporting of elections rather than private funding for elections, and the amount of money that once you're elected, you have to spend time generating money for your next election?
So I'll say, first of all, I tend to be one of those rare agnostics on money in politics. It's not necessarily the place I work. There are people on both sides who are firmly convinced that money in politics is working entirely for the other side. And you can find that opinion very widely held amongst both conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. And generally, I think, in my experience researching voters and why they make choices, voters are very, very complex things. And it is really hard to understand why voters vote in certain ways. And I think a lot of that money might not have the impacts that it's supposed to. And furthermore, even beyond money, we've talked, there's a lot of folks who talk about the election legislation that's passing in states and whether it's voter suppression or it allows voter fraud. And even when it's intended to suppress the vote, it rarely does. Voters are really complex. We just had the highest turnout in American history in the middle of a global pandemic where we didn't have vaccines and we didn't even understand really everything we know about how it was transmitted. And 20 million more human beings showed up to vote than ever before. Does this mean global pandemics lead to higher turnout?
No.
No, of course not. But it just shows how complex we are when we make our decisions. And I don't know there's really good evidence that money in politics overall, that we'd have a better thing. I also think it's very unlikely to change things. What I do know is that a lot of the click here to donate that we're talking about, this isn't going into electing candidates that the people who are soliciting these donations think would do a good job. It's lining their pockets. Sidney Powell, for instance, raised about $20 million in the 2 or 3 weeks after the election. And then we all celebrated when a Michigan court sanctioned her $200,000. That's a pretty good profit margin. You know, Sidney Powell's probably not running for election. I mean, I don't want to say it. With the people who are running for RNC chair now and state chairs, maybe some of this will happen, but I think that's some of the money that I'm most concerned about.
And there is something also to keep in mind about money in politics. Having a lot of money doesn't guarantee you're going to win an election. Ask Jamie Harrison. He's the current DNC chair. He outraised Lindsey Graham by $20 million in South Carolina in 2020, he lost by 20 points. The Democratic nominee running against Mitch McConnell in that same election cycle of 2020 in the Kentucky Senate race outraised him by 15 or lost, again by 20 points. There are plenty of examples of lots of money not equating to electoral victory. I once wrote a book called The 15 Biggest Lies in Politics, and one of the lies I said was more money equals victory. It's not true. Money in politics is like gasoline in a NASCAR race. It explains why the cars go around the track, but that's all. You have to have the gas to go around the track, no doubt. But you have to have a good car, a good driver, and a good team. All those things matter. And every time Congress has gotten involved in the money matrix, it has done one thing with vast unexpected consequences. I'm sure there were conversations here all through the lead up to McCain-Feingold about how that would purify politics. What did McCain-Feingold give us? Got rid of soft money at the national committee level. What did that do? That disempowered national committees. And that sent money elsewhere, which led to litigation over the privacy rights of labor unions and corporations, which gave us Citizens United. Okay? Money is going to be involved in American politics, and this country will never accept government-supported political speech. It never will. It's antithetical to an entire national founding. We'll never do it. So money is going to be involved in politics. The only thing I've ever come down on is full disclosure as fast as possible. And let the money be seen, and then let the drivers, the team, and the quality of the car decide the race.
I think we got time for one more in the back.
Hi. I just had a quick question. It was, hold up, a question left me. In 2020, do you see any problem with Mark Zuckerberg pouring, you kind of touched on it already, but Mark Zuckerberg pouring $420 million into the election at all? Do you see anything wrong with that, or?
I know this well, and we talk about it in the book.
We talk about it in the book.
My organization, my nonpartisan nonprofit, distributed over $60 million of that money. I'll just say briefly that that money came into play only after Congress and the state legislatures failed to act to help inform voters and help voters navigate an unprecedented election in the middle of a global pandemic. They were begged to act, to give election offices more resources for things like plexiglass, for things like hand sanitizer, masks, single-use pens. These things don't grow on trees, especially in November. These things cost money. How do you think we recruited the 400,000 new poll workers nationwide? That doesn't happen magically. That takes money. How do you think we tell people that there are ways to vote that they might not have used before? You might be scared to show up at a polling place. Here's a way that you can request a mail ballot, and here's an easy way to do it online, to request the ballot. The ballot still has to be paper. So that's how that came about. And it's in the book. If you look at my website, electioninnovation.org, I put out a full accounting for all of this money in March of 2021, a long time ago. I literally contacted every single state. I know all of the election directors. And I said, there are grants available if you want to help educate voters about how to navigate an election during COVID. It went to the reddest state and the bluest state, all of them. And I said, you make a proposal, submit the amount of money you request. And what we did was we gave every state exactly how much they request. There were red states that went to Trump. There were blue states that went to Biden. There were purple states that went to either one. And it went to sending nonpartisan mailers to all voters or other media that said, oh, if you want, here's the website to request a mail ballot. Here's where you go to find out when the early voting days are. And that was true across the country. And by the way, this was known to everybody in September of 2021. There is a New York Times article in the middle of September. How do I know the Trump campaign and Republicans knew about this? Because they filed lawsuits in multiple states saying this should not be allowed. And this goes back to our original point. They filed those lawsuits and they lost in every single case. And that money was crucial because legislatures didn't act. I want to be clear. I get asked all the time, are there more grants coming? God, I hope not. And it's not because I think it's bad that philanthropy stepped in, but it was not plan A. It should never be plan A that a functioning first world democracy needs to rely upon philanthropy for hand sanitizer. But it was in 2020 because government failed to step up to a national challenge and election officials had needs that it couldn't meet. And this is all done transparently, and it was all done under the rule of law. And it's ultimately not about the money, because the same people who complained about it put dark money into the Cyber Ninjas campaign, millions of dollars. Put dark money into the Wisconsin review, and we're now trying to funnel dark money to hire the lawyers in Cochise County, Arizona, to defend their illegal unwillingness to certify votes in that county after the 2022 election.
And one other thing about that, part of the conversation around that money is that, well, maybe it went into urban areas and boosted turnout. Turnout was higher across the country. And if you look at the most important battleground states, the most important voting shift from 2016 to 2020, not only in raw numbers but in percentages, was in suburbs and exurbs, where this money, if it was urbanly concentrated, did not make the decisive difference. The decisive difference was voters who cast ballots in one way in 2016 in the suburbs and exurbs, exurbs being outside of suburbs, farther away from the urban core, in Georgia, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, in Nevada, voted for Biden.
Yeah, and just one real quick point, as we talked about this in the book as well, Trump did better in Philadelphia and Detroit in 2020 than he did in 2016.
No doubt. Look it up.
I mean, that's just a fact. He did better in those places.
Because turnout was up.
I mean, it was, and he got more raw votes, and he got a higher percentage of the votes in those two places. And in several other places around the country, in urban areas, he actually did better in 2020 than in 2016.
Is it okay if I ask one more question?
Yeah.
I thought about my original question. What would you say to people who say that there were a lot of, guess, quote unquote, dead people voting in 2020?
I've got a really easy answer for that.
Yeah.
That's illegal. Bring the evidence to court. This is, I will humbly say this. I probably know more about the voter registration list in this country than almost anyone in this country. I've been working on this for a long time. I work with deeply red states and deeply blue states. And I believe very firmly that despite what the extremes on both sides say, it is good to have as many eligible voters on the rolls, and it's also good to clean the rolls with from people who aren't eligible anymore, if, for instance, they have, as we might say, aged out of voting. I think you know what I'm trying to say. And in a very specific instance, it was alleged in Georgia, right after the election, that over 10,000 dead people had voted in Georgia. And the Secretary of State, a Trump voter himself, looked into that, investigated it fully. Do you know how many dead voters in Georgia were found? 2. That's exactly right. Both of them, by the way, not someone impersonating a dead voter. Both of them, people who had very recently deceased, like in the 2 weeks before the election, and their spouse returned their ballot. Okay, so these are, which is understandable. It's not a proper ballot. I don't know that it rises to voter fraud or something that's inherently evil, but it is. Those ballots shouldn't have been counted. 2 in the state of Georgia. So this is one of those other things. Dead people voting can be proven. I know. I do these cases. Voter fraud is actually one of the easiest crimes to find. You have witnesses. You have documentary evidence. You have voter lists. You have ballots. You usually have someone who has physically presented themselves to other human beings in a place. That's a great case to prosecute, and yet very few of them ever result in convictions. There's just no widespread dead people voting in the United States. It is really a testament not to lawyers, it's a testament to those people that we were talking about, the election officials. Do you think the most liberal Democrat in the United States wants a dead person voting in their jurisdiction? Do you think the most conservative Republican in the United States wants to turn away an otherwise eligible voter from voting? I can tell you the answer. The answer is no to both. They take great pride in the integrity and accessibility of their systems, as I'm sure you found when you've gone and voted. And that's true across the United States. These people are truly dedicated public servants who are in those jobs not because they went to school to learn to be election administrators for all the fame and glory that goes along with it.
Right.
They didn't join their high school's young election officials club. They mostly got into this job by accident. They applied for a job that looked kind of good, and what did they find when they got there? They found a calling. Let's start from a position of inherent gratitude and trust for these people. And if evidence comes up that should be shaken or should be challenged, we can respond to that evidence. But so far, these people are who make our democracy tick.
And well, I'd like to say one last thing before we wrap up. I've been in New Hampshire 2 nights that I remember very, very distinctly. 1992, the comeback kid declared not victory, but a close second, and got out of town very quickly. Bill Clinton's campaign didn't know exactly how close he would get to Paul Tsongas in that race, but they hoped it would be close enough to do exactly what they did, but they didn't know. They thought they might, but they didn't know. 2008, I came here covering the Obama campaign, fresh off an Iowa caucus victory. I was in Portsmouth when Hillary Clinton teared up. I was in that donut shop, or small diner, I can't remember which it was, but in Portsmouth. I remember talking to the Obama campaign how confident they were, and I remember talking to the Clinton campaign how in disarray they were. There was this whole conversation about would they dismantle the entire campaign structure if they lost New Hampshire. Hillary Clinton won New Hampshire. Bill Clinton came in relatively close. This is not a Clinton story, by the way. It's a story about something that for the longest time of my life covering national politics I overlooked, which is that quiet time on primary day or election day when all the wise people, the strategists, the fundraisers, the speechwriters, the candidate, the spouses, they know what they hope, but they don't know what's going to happen. And they wait. And they wait in that silent space. And what do they wait for? They wait for the people to tell them what they want. In all my life covering national politics until 2020, I just overlooked that silent miracle moment in America, just taking it for granted, assuming it just happened. Well, it doesn't just happen. It takes Americans to do that work that David just described, so that voice of the people telling them what they want can be rendered. That's another reason we wrote this book, because I fault myself for overlooking that magic, silent time and the people who give that voice clarity. The other thing I want to say about those in this audience who might be Republicans, look, I want both parties to be strong in this country. Our country is fortified by a two-party system. And a national party cannot exist with this unresolved existential issue of whether an election is true or not. It can't. It simply cannot. Because if any national party aspires to power with the fundamental belief that the only election that is acceptable in this country is when it wins, it is by definition overtly hostile to the fundamentals of the constitutional republic. And I don't want any legacy party in our country, Republican or Democrat, to fall into that chasm. So the reason we wrote the book. I'm not pro-Republican, I'm not pro-Democrat, I'm pro-American constitutional republic. The greatest privilege of my life has been able to cover the national political story of our country. And this particular story is the biggest one I've ever covered. And I thank you for being here tonight so very much.
Yes, we got a pro-New Hampshire primary person. Thank you both for coming. I will say that this book is great, and the testament to that, by the way, is we usually have a book signing, and we usually go and pick up every book we can find in New Hampshire, and we've hit the Barnes and Nobles. I've cleaned them all out, and so it might take a few days to get some new ones, but it's definitely worth a read, and I think on behalf of all the people in New Hampshire, town clerks and all those volunteers, particularly, thank you. So thank you very much.
I'm very happy. Very happy. Thank you. Thank you.